is going to start in a couple of minutes due to our broadcasting program. Thank you. Welcome. This is Subin Cho, a project consultant of the Preparatory Office for WIPIC, the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites. Apologize for the delay of the broadcasting due to our technical problems. Well, pleasure to meet you all at the 2021 online lecture series on understanding World Heritage interpretation and presentation. Highly appreciate you all for joining today's lecture. The 2021 WIPIC online lecture series has been held once a month since last April. Well, starting with Professor Mario Centeni's lecture, we had lectures with President Alberto Galandini, Professor Maria Greve Burbis, and Dr. Hafizur Rahman. Today, we are going to have a lecture with Professor Mike Robinson. Lectures will be held once a month until this October, and a special discussion will be held in November. The poster with the full schedule you are watching is uploaded on our Facebook and YouTube and our Instagram too. If you are joining the lecture on YouTube, then you can find the link to our Facebook and Instagram on the live streaming video's description. And to lead World Heritage interpretation and word presentation into a more communicative, inclusive, and sustainable one, we need your active cooperation. So come and join the lectures and leave your opinions and questions about the lectures and World Heritage issues on our live streaming videos. And as we have time for questions after having the lectures. Well, now, before we start today's lecture, I would like to introduce our lecturer, Professor Mike Robinson. Professor Mike Robinson is Professor Emeritus in Cultural Heritage at the University of Birmingham and former director of the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage, involving the Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site. He is adjunct professor at Nottingham Trent University and visiting professor at National Taiwan University. Also, he was previously founder and director of the Center for Tourism and Cultural Change. For 30 years, his work has focused upon the relations between heritage, tourism, culture, and how these realms intersect. Recent research focuses on World Heritage and sustainable development, communicating World Heritage, as well as heritage, enterprise, and regeneration. He has advised the UNESCO World Heritage Program in sustainable tourism and was principal consultant to the UNESCO World Heritage European Journeys project. He has worked with UNESCO offices in China, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and has worked on heritage and tourism-related projects in over 40 countries with UNESCO, European Commission, Council of Europe, and various state agencies and NGOs. and he is currently working with the UNESCO office in Uzbekistan. Now, let's start today's lecture. A great pleasure to meet you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world. And I'm very honored to be invited to speak to you in this wonderful lecture series. And first of all, I'd like to offer my congratulations on your new Category 2 Centre, because I think it directs its attention to what I think is one of the major issues in World Heritage, which underpins a lot of the overarching discussion that we can have about World Heritage sites in the world. Today, I want to speak to you about the communication of World Heritage. But you will see from my title that I've turned it around a little bit, and I've said communicating the heritage of the world, because clearly interpretation does not just apply to World Heritage sites, it applies to any form of heritage. And so I could be speaking about, and I have spoken about, interpretation in the museum sector and other aspects of cultural heritage, including intangible cultural heritage as well. I would like to start with an image of a book. I work a lot with narratives, and so, like any good academic, I have a lot of books and I read a lot of books. And one of the things that we do is that we value books. We value books because books have a use; they have a value to us. They instruct us. We can learn from them. They have they carry a lot of information. And they are there. And although we now read everything online, books still have a very important purpose in our lives. And I want to sort of develop this metaphor of narrative in the book a little bit further in my presentation. But I thought it would be only appropriate to start with this visual metaphor.
예, 지금 중간에 끊겼다가 지금 다시 시작이 됐는데.
So the questions that I ask myself when visiting World Heritage sites, and I'm fortunate enough to visit many World Heritage sites, I ask myself these questions. I say, okay, what is worldly about this site? What am I learning from this site? What is this World Heritage site? And increasingly, what good does it do? And that's a moral question. And World Heritage poses very important moral questions to us, I believe. Now, I've divided my presentation into, keeping this metaphor going, I've divided my presentation roughly into 6 chapters. I want to start off by sort of just looking at the changing role, the purposes of World Heritage sites. Then to think about the audiences, the challenges of changing audiences. I then want to look at the interaction, the relationship between the audience and heritage, between the subject and object. Think about some of the narrative choices that we have. We have agency in this. And this is important to recognize. I want to touch upon some issues of translation. And then I want to return to this metaphor of great literature, and how that may relate to great heritage, which we symbolize in a sense by calling it World Heritage. So if we can start with some background. And many of you will be familiar with the changing contexts and the increased pressures on World Heritage sites and their management. it's not a straightforward process to look after World Heritage. World Heritage isn't just for Christmas. World Heritage is for eternity. There's nothing in the 1972 convention which says that you have a World Heritage site just for a finite length of time. If it's managed, it should be there for beyond our lifespan into the next generations. But we increasingly need to engage with local communities, and this was recognized in UNESCO, the World Heritage Centre, through the so-called fifth C in the strategic objectives, increasing need to engage with local communities. Now, this happens at various paces in different parts of the world, but nevertheless, it's a changing context. We don't just we have to bring in local communities. Local communities are the rightful guardians, if you like, of their World Heritage sites. And again, although it's strange to talk about this in these times of COVID pandemic, tourism is a very big aspect to World Heritage. And there's an increasing need both to attract, depending on where you are in the world, or to manage tourism and tourists. So whichever side of the spectrum you're on, whether you want to have more tourists or whether you have too many tourists, we need to deal with this phenomenon of international tourism, and hopefully things at least will return to some normality fairly soon. And of course, there's been a shift in the singular purpose of protecting a site to making a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, it's not just about protecting sites, it's also about contributing to the wider dimension of sustainable development. And that brings into play notions of cultural well-being and intercultural dialogue. And again, I'll say a little bit more about that as we progress. But something which we'll all be aware of is that there are severe pressures on resources for the management of World Heritage sites. I haven't come across a World Heritage site yet which doesn't have problems of finance, for things that it wants to do, to protect, to conserve, and to interpret the heritage. I think there are problems with regard to the lack of civic engagement, how far civil society and of course, underpinning this, I think there's a more serious aspect regarding the lack of meaning. And particularly for younger generations, what does World Heritage actually mean? And that's a big question I will return to. It would be sensible to start with the text of the 1972 World Heritage Convention. What does that tell us about the communication of World Heritage? What does it tell us about what we should do to interpret World Heritage? And actually, it tells us very little. And the nearest we can probably find to this in the convention text itself is under Article 27, which is about education and information programs directed to try to encourage people to strengthen appreciation and respect for their heritage, and by definition to contribute to the protection, ongoing protection and conservation of a property. And again, it says, again, state parties, they shall undertake to keep the public broadly informed of the dangers threatening heritage and then of the activities carried on to protect this heritage. But that actually tells us very little about how you interpret a World Heritage site. And if we were then to go, and I won't do this, but if we were then to go into the operational guidelines, which are now significant in terms of the guidance provided, the operational guidelines say very little about the purpose of interpretation, what the messages should be. They suggest some modes in a very short-term way. They suggest some modes of interpretation and some interpretive techniques, but they don't really tell us about why we should be interpreting World Heritage or what the messages are of that interpretation. Clearly, the defining quality of World Heritage is its outstanding universal value. And outstanding universal value is quite a difficult concept for most people to think about. So you would think that when we come to a World Heritage Site, within the interpretation of that World Heritage Site, there should be some mention or some attempt to translate this concept of outstanding universal value, OUV, to the general public. So it really should be, why is this a World Heritage Site? OUV is defining. So where is that interpretation? This is the sort of interpretation you find, not just on World Heritage Sites, but many heritage sites. So you have an interpretation board, you have texts, you can see maybe this text is in different languages. There may be some diagrams, there may be some figures, some photographs, but it tells us about the history of the site. It tells us about, maybe it gives us some sort of historical information about the site, but at no point does it tell us why this is a World Heritage Site, the defining quality. And I think this is a really big issue. What we have, and again, I'm pointing out this in relation to World Heritage Sites, but it could apply to many heritage sites. What we have is an interpretive focus with strong emphasis on providing historical narratives, sometimes very technical narratives. And for most times, the people who arrive at heritage sites are not technicians. They are not trained archaeologists or trained art historians or trained architects, but they are confronted with technical narratives. And also, we have a tendency to default to what I would call national and occasional nationalist narratives. So we are told about how significant this site is for the particular locale, the particular region or country. But that doesn't tell us anything about the universal condition of heritage, the specialness of World Heritage, because World Heritage is supposed to speak of the universal condition of humanity. So when I come across these forms of interpretation, and I've singled out interpretation boards, but I could be talking about a tour guide who sort of works with a preordained script, which tends to be either very technical or very historical. So I'm asking the question, what do we learn from all this? What can we learn about World Heritage and what it really stands for? So if I can sort of bring this down to a series of issues, which I think, again, impact upon our notions of interpretation. Interpretation is frequently dense, it is content focused, and it is overly descriptive. Now, I'm aware that interpretation has to convey certain amounts of information, but nevertheless, everywhere I go in the world, I see very densely, very descriptive interpretation, which does not convey the meaning of the site. It tends to be authored very academically, which again, I understand that. As an academic, I understand that. But nevertheless, you know, we tend to objectify and detach ourselves from the heritage. We are outside of the meaning of the heritage to an extent. And something, again, I will return to is that there is largely an absence of context, of plot, if you like, if you want to use that metaphor. So again, back to the issue. If you think about the book, you know, what is the purpose of the book? Why do we have the book? You know, what is it trying to tell us? What is the big picture? Where does it fit in a global sense? And I think there are many opportunities that are overlooked, particularly with World Heritage Sites, for getting across important global messages. And part of that would be the Sustainable Development Goals. And generally, there is a lack of guidance provided within the World Heritage system. We have a lot of UNESCO and World Heritage. We introduced an upstreaming system. But this calls for a downstreaming system. What happens when you have a World Heritage Site inscribed? How do you then best interpret it? Where is the guidance for that in terms of what messages that heritage needs to convey? The gentleman you see on the screen is the author and writer, critic, George Bernard Shaw. And I like this quote from George Bernard Shaw because I think it sums up a lot of what problems there are in the interpretation field. Is that the biggest single problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And so just by putting up a plaque, even we invest in, you know, a new fancy digital app or whatever, we still might be kidding ourselves that somehow we are communicating. And the problem is, how do we know? And telling people that something is World Heritage assumes, well, it assumes a lot. It assumes they know what World Heritage is. They assume that they know its value. They assume it needs protection and that they understand the concept and how it operates. And again, going back to the sort of Article 27 in the convention, if you like, you know, yes, it is important to talk about the threats to World Heritage and the need for protection. But where are we informed about the opportunities that World Heritage presents to communities and the rest of the world? That should be part of the interpretation as well. In all of this, the world, as always, moves on. And the world is a very different place to how it was when the convention was first conceived in the beginning of the 1970s. The audiences for heritage generally now no longer speak to a homogeneous audience. Audiences for heritage are multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural. We don't have to just look at domestic tourism audiences, which are very much more sophisticated in terms of what they want to get out of their heritage. We now have to think about international tourist audiences. And of course, lots of World Heritage Sites, by definition, are important tourist attractions. People congregate to World Heritage Sites. So the audiences for World Heritage have become much more complex. And the biggest challenge I think we face is actually the generational change. And I know that, working with students from year to year to year to year, you see these changes. If you've been in universities for a long period of time, you see these changes very visibly. And I will give you a very pertinent example. The World Heritage Site that I have worked with for many years at Ironbridge, the world's first iron bridge, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, if you like. I once took some Chinese visitors there and to part of the site, and as part of the interpretation is very good. It's live interpretation. There we were burning coal to make steam to show how the steam engines worked. So as you entered the site, you could smell the coal in the air. Now, for me, growing up many years ago, that smell was very nostalgic. It was something that I remembered back from my youth, the smell of coal, burning coal. For my Chinese visitors who were still burning coal, it was a fairly normal smell. These people came from Harbin in the northeast of China, and it was a very familiar smell. But what was interesting was the young girl who was the interpreter in her early 20s, who said to me, "What's that strange smell?" And I pointed to a pile of coal, and I said, "It's that." And she said, "Well, what is it?" And she hadn't seen coal. Now, that was I thought, well, this girl is not very good. But why should she know coal? Which young people now know of coal? We're trying to get rid of coal in a decarbonizing environment now. So not only I have to explain the whole context of how societies grew up with this coal. This is a disconnect between generations. We forget not everybody has this prior knowledge. So again, we have to move beyond what I say moving beyond Article 27 here. And tourists ask very good questions. Tourists are incredibly useful for asking really good, simple questions. And they ask questions like, well, what does World Heritage mean? What is outstanding universal value? Why is World Heritage different to other heritage? They also ask, because again, if you work in the sector, you know what UNESCO is. We all know what it stands for. I'm sure you all can understand the acronym. Who or what is UNESCO? And a really important question is, why is this site relevant to me? Why are some people interested in this site and others are not interested in this site? And that happens. Not everybody is interested in World Heritage or heritage. And how can we use this site for wider benefit? I think these are really important analytical questions. As tourists, as visitors, our engagement with heritage and World Heritage is very rapid. We may spend very little time. It may have taken centuries to create a World Heritage site, a cultural landscape, and we actually spend a tiny percentage of time in that space with that heritage. So we have to convey in a very short space of time a lot of information. And when I see interpretation in action, I'm always asking the question, how does the audience make sense of culture and heritage? Here you see people listening on their devices, the interpretation of Stonehenge. But how do they make sense of it? Okay, I know what the narrative is. How do they make sense of this? And this is where I think we move into what I call the great unknown, because we don't know. And I think we should acknowledge the fact that lots of things we don't know, and we make assumptions. When we see somebody in an art gallery looking at a painting, what is happening? What are those people absorbing? What is the relationship? Because it will be different. And we may think that these people are understand the painting they're looking at, but we don't know. Again, we have to ask the question, what is happening? Is this just a photo opportunity? Is heritage, are objects just photo opportunities because they look pretty or they look nice or it looks different? Or is this something, a meaningful relationship which happens when people are put in contact with heritage, stroke world heritage? But again, lots of assumptions are made that something happens. And by putting a little plaque or a little sign there, that makes it better. In cognitive psychology, it's the basis of the education process. In any sort of study of good pedagogy, we should be asking the questions, what do we remember? What do we understand? And what do we learn? And they are three slightly different questions. They're all interrelated. But these are things which I think these are very difficult questions, and I think we need to pose them at all stages of the interpretive process. I want to move to talk about a particular World Heritage Site. This is the World Heritage Site which I'm very familiar with. This is at Ironbridge, as I say, in the UK. Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site inscribed in 1986. And this is important. But for some people, it's just a pile of bricks. And so we have a choice of how we interpret this pile of bricks. And the interpretation which is present at the site is this. Now, it's in different languages, reflecting, it's in Japanese, it's in French, it's in Spanish and German, I think. But this is what is presented. It's the world's first coke-fired furnace for the production of iron in 1709. Operated by Abraham Darby at Coalbrookdale, Shropshire. The production of iron using coke rather than coal allowed the commercial production of iron. And if you like, the sort of the synthetic statement which comes from this is that it's the birthplace of mass iron production and the birthplace, therefore, of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's on this basis that this site was inscribed, or partly inscribed, as World Heritage. But if you look at that, and if you analyze that text, there's lots of assumptions in there. We assume that people know what coke is. We assume who Abraham Darby was. We assume where Coalbrookdale is. And again, it assumes that people know about a blast furnace. So behind the sort of the simple interpretation is a series of contextual questions that are not really addressed. Now, that gives us one set of issues about how we should better inform the public. And of course, that does happen. There are little signs and diagrams around the monument which show how coal and coke is produced, etc. So it's not without context in this example. But there's also another narrative choice. It still doesn't address the context of relevance. So what I would like to see is, instead of saying this is the birthplace of mass iron production and the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, which of course it is, and nobody's disputing that, or some people do, it's also the birthplace of global warming. The first time that fossil fuels were used on a mass scale to produce things. So maybe in the interpretation of the site, we could raise awareness of climate change. We could indicate the need for environmental concern. We could maybe use the site as a space, as an object, as a focal point for discussing new pollution control technologies. And because iron was exported around the world from this site, maybe it's a focus for discussing international trade. Now, that's a choice that sites have to make, and very few of them are making those choices. They are defaulting to the technical historical narrative rather than thinking about how can we make this site relevant to new generations and contemporary global concerns. Now, interpretation breaks down very quickly with language. If I say anything in Korean script, I have no idea what that means. When we see something like this, if we deal in numbers, there's no translation necessary. Everybody would understand 2 and 2 equals. Those symbols are universal. These symbols are not universal. If I visit a temple in Korea, or anywhere in Asia, I need some translation. I don't know about temples, about what the meaning is of the architecture. I don't know what the way to enter and exit. I don't necessarily know what these people are doing and why there are lots of little lights at the back here. So if I'm coming from a different culture, from a different context, I need to have some information more than just saying this temple was built in whenever, or this temple is dedicated to whatever. In the same way, as because of my background and culture, I understand the symbolism of a church. But other people who don't come from that Christian tradition and haven't had much experiences of churches don't know. So again, it's not just about saying this church was built or this cathedral was built in 1356 or whatever. It's about saying, no, this is why it looks like this. This is what happens here. This is what people do. This is what people feel about it. This is why these places were built. A lot more contextual translation. Because translation goes beyond words, but really needs to deal with the meanings and the cultural contexts. And how do you make meanings come alive so that other people from different cultures and different generations can connect? And something very important that I think one of your lecturers may have already have touched upon this, is that conflict should actually be part of the translation. We shouldn't shy away from the difficult aspects of interpretation, because interpretation is a process of negotiation between, again, the subject and the object. And so if there are very difficult histories and also very difficult presents, we should really be using interpretation to engage with these in a more universal way. And I think all of this, is about the production of opportunities for genuine intercultural dialogue and intergenerational dialogue. And how many World Heritage Sites really move away from their location, from their national contexts? I would suggest very few. Heritage sites and material culture in general, I think, are very important in the translation process. When people can see, can feel, can be part of this interpretation. It's an active part of the interpretation process. It's not just about reading a book or looking at a screen or looking at a video. It's about being there, being able to see, touch. That's what makes it special. It forces us, I think, to reflect on ourselves, and something which I always get across when I do interpretation work is, again, do we see what others see, and do others see what we see? We always have to reflect on the site, its meanings, and on ourselves. Where do we position ourselves in relation to the site, and vice versa? And how do we generate connections? I would suggest emotional connections. I've worked a lot with emotions in heritage and in tourism. What do we want to understand? And also, again, not moving away from confrontation, but embedding confrontation in our interpretation to challenge and provoke to action. And again, think about these bigger issues now that we have around World Heritage, which is about, how can World Heritage contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals? We can make World Heritage help us confront and challenge some of the issues that we all have to face as a global society. So World Heritage, I think, and I'm using the visual metaphor of a bridge here, in a sense, it should be there. If any form of World Heritage can do this, World Heritage, with its claim to universalism, should be there to connect cultures, should be there to connect generations, to provide context, to give us these connections, give us this perspective on the world, on life, on humanity, and also make itself relevant. And if you take people from either a different culture, from a different generation to some places, and you can see it in their eyes, and what are we doing here? Well, why is this relevant to me? Why should I be bothered about this? There are so many other things happening in the world. So many other distractions, so many other important issues in the world. Why is this relevant? We have to make World Heritage relevant. So, some thoughts. I would like to think that we can move to narratives that are aware of cultural diversity. And I use the term super diversity there. It's a concept that I work with. Birmingham, a place where I work, is a city of 85 different languages. 85 different languages, over 120 different cultures in the same city. So whose heritage are we talking about here? And think about the diversity and the generational change of the mobilities in the world. And tourism is a very big part of this, and of all of these translation issues. And maybe we should be thinking about narratives that reach beyond the immediate to challenge and embrace the change, and that can link to past and present and future. So World Heritage Sites are not in a bubble. They had a history, but they also have a future. And they can tell that stories of, they can tell about continuity. They can tell about rupture and disjunction. And I think that recognition that encounters with heritage may have little to do with the significance that we place on that heritage, but on what others place on that heritage. So we have to think about who are we in the interpretive process. Interpretation shouldn't be for us that know, it should be for those that maybe don't know or want to know. And this use of meta-narratives, these big narratives that transcend cultural boundaries and really build true transnational connections. And maybe you noticed at the beginning of this lecture, I put up a photograph of a site in Korea, World Heritage Site in Korea, which is a dolmen. It's an ancient burial place, which is basically stones constructed. Now, Korea has a very high percentage of these dolmens in the world, but these dolmens can be found in many different parts of the world, in the UK, in Ireland, in other parts of Europe. You know, there is a transnational connection to be made that can tell this, tell about a universal. Why is it that this form has a universal form? What does that tell us about the world in the past, but what does it tell us about the world in the present? So I said I would return to this notion of narrative. I want to finish with this, and I want you to think about what makes great literature. Now, all of you will have your favorite book, and maybe a book you've read in childhood, or a book that you keep going back to, or a book which you've even seen made into a movie. Some of these books are very specific in terms of their origins, and arguably great literature transcends these boundaries. So Robinson Crusoe, Pride and Prejudice, and The Nine Cloud Dream, which I know is a very classical sort of Korean novel, great Russian novel, War and Peace, they've all been translated, which allows us access to different worlds. It allows us access to different cultures, different backgrounds, different stories. So when you explore what makes great literature, you come up with a list, something like this, and just bear this in mind with the books that you've enjoyed, or your favorite novel of all time, if you want to put it like that. So what makes great literature? Well, great literature says something important about the world. It says something about the human condition, who we are, our frailties. It's memorable. You read a book as a child and you still remember the messages that it has. The messages of the book last a long time. And of course, great literature is shared from one generation to another. So we pass these narratives down through generations, and everybody gets enjoyment from it. Again, it's a very interesting psychological question about what touches us. But great literature stirs our emotions. We read a page and we cry, or we laugh. It makes us think. Great literature inspires people. You read a book, and you want to go and create something, you want to change your life, you want to do something. You read your book and it leaves you feeling better for having read it. It was an enjoyable experience. And if it's such a good book, if it's really great literature, you may read it again and again because it remains relevant. And also, as I mentioned, it translates into different cultures, into different languages. So it has this transcendental quality. Now, just hold that in mind, because if you think about World Heritage and what World Heritage is, well, what makes World Heritage? And I suggest to you that you can overlay those notions about World Heritage. What really should World Heritage be about? What makes World Heritage World Heritage? Well, it should say something important about the world, about the human condition. Not a humanity, the condition of humanity, not of a nation, but about humanity. It should be memorable. You visit a World Heritage site, and what you get from it should last a long time. It's shared from one generation to another. That's partly the mechanism underpinning World Heritage. That World Heritage has lasted from generation to generation and will continue to be protected and last into the future. Does it stir the emotions? Does it touch us? Does it sort of have an effect on us? If we see the sunrise over the temple of Borobudur, or if we stand on the side of the Grand Canyon and look at this vast space, if we visit a place like Auschwitz, it stirs our emotions. And hopefully World Heritage should inspire people. Maybe we need to do better on this one. We need to use World Heritage to inspire people, to create, to change things. Again, think back to the Sustainable Development Goals, which UNESCO is now aligned with. And it leaves readers feeling better for having read it. Well, you can interpret this, it leaves visitors feeling better for having visited. And it is reread, it is revisited. We want to go back to this place. We want to find out more about it, or more about its meanings. And it remains relevant to different generations, relevant across cultures in the transcendental way that is part of this universal value. And importantly, it is translated into different cultures. And I'm not here talking about you have a sign in different languages. I'm talking about this cultural translation, which makes the effort to communicate in different cultural contexts. So I think there's something we can learn from looking at literature and narrative and how that can be embedded in the interpretation of World Heritage. And for me, every World Heritage site is a gateway to 1,000 stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful lecture, and genuinely apologize for our audio problems that occurred during your lecture. We will upload the clean version of today's lecture on our both on our Facebook and YouTube channel. And yes, of course, today's public participants also left lots of questions. But before we start the Q&A session, I would like to say that yes, it is really important to know the significance of World Heritage, but also important to learn about the history and backgrounds and the culture embedded on World Heritage. Because by knowing that, World Heritage, in my personal opinion, can be a language that can help people to communicate with others of other groups, so that we can also deal with the problems the world is facing too. So really appreciate for your insightful lecture. And well, let's start this Q&A session. The first question is left on our Facebook by Vivian. And the question was, I found that World Heritage interpretation is more inflexible because their burden. I have received quite a similar story during several visits when I was 13 years old, and 20 years old, and 46 years old. It is not easy for the management to change because of their OUV. Yeah, that was the question.
Okay, maybe the question is it easy for the management to change, or is it difficult for management to change because of their concerns about OUV? I agree that there is interpretation at many World Heritage sites is inflexible. And I understand the practical issues of having of time and money and expertise to direct to interpretation, because most World Heritage sites are preoccupied with the conservation of the site and the protection of the site, and interpretation doesn't necessarily sort of come top in the list of things to do. But nevertheless, I think there's lots of things that World Heritage sites can do to better their interpretation. Let me put it this way, some interpretation at World Heritage sites is absolutely dreadful. In fact, it's non-existent in some sites. So we are talking about different scales of a problem here. But I think it's precisely because of outstanding universal value. Outstanding universal value, the clue is in the words, outstanding, universal, value. These are three big words. So what is there in your interpretation that is trying to communicate how outstanding this site is, how universal this site is, and what value it has to society? So I think that's a fair point raised, that there is a lot of inflexibility, but I think that's partly a sort of an old school tradition, in a sense, of what interpretation should be, rather than thinking about what it should be or what it could be. So I agree, it is very difficult for some sites to sort of engage in this, but nevertheless, I think it's beholden upon sites to really try to get to grips with what outstanding universal value means to for everyday people.
Great, thank you for your answer. And we will move on to our next question. The second question was, couldn't agree more with all the suggestion. It is already discussed in various books about interpretation. However, very few people in the management really study on how to interpret. Then what is your suggestion to expedite the process of heritage use management to really learn about interpretation? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's a good question. I think there have been certain ways of thinking about interpretation, and they've worked for many years. Don't get me wrong, and we all go back to Tilden's model of interpretation, and its various. And I know there's been some very good work done on interpretation, and you know I can find many good models of interpretation in heritage sites and museums around the world. I can also find very bad ones as well. So it depends upon where you are in that sort of that learning education process, that training process, that management process about interpretation. But I think one thing which is sometimes overlooked, and again, is just observe the behavior of visitors to a heritage site. Just look at how your visitors interact with the heritage, and ask them, you know, what do you feel about it? Not, you know, what do you learn about this site? What does this site tell you? You use your visitors as a means to sort of to get to grips with how they understand the site, you know. And also, I think, you know, challenge people. I don't think there's a sort of a quick way when they say expedite the process. There's no quick way of doing this. You have to undo a lot of history and undo a lot of sort of cultures and structures in a way, sometimes to do this. But finding out what these sites mean to people, I think, is a starting point. And I can observe, because I've observed this on many occasions, and lots of people will associate with this. You see visitors approaching a World Heritage Site, and they take a few photographs and then they leave. That's where's the engagement? You know, where's the emotion in that? Now, I'm not saying that's not a valuable practice, and it's certainly a common practice. But that's not doing, the World Heritage Site is not doing the job to hold people there, make people interested. Again, think about it in terms of a book. You know, what you want, what attracts you to a novel, what attracts you to a book, you know, it's got to be very attractive. You know, it's got to have a good summary. It's got to sort of, you know, have the right language to get you in. It's got to speak to you. Well, unfortunately, lots of interpretation isn't about speaking to you, it's about speaking internally. It's an internal language. So it's a good question. There's no single easy way, but I do believe you can observe and learn from your observations. And you can observe a tour guide, you can observe tour groups, you know, and you will find the tour groups that are invariably consist of about three different groups. There's the immediate ones, which are really listening intently to what's being said, and they're probably the experts. And then you've got a sort of another ring of people around the tour guide who are sort of half listening and half interested, and then you've got the rest of them on their mobile phones and looking for where to go for a cup of coffee. So, you know, I mean, partly that's human nature, but you know, if you are a good storyteller, if you have a good story to tell, I think you can really engage people. But you can observe and learn a lot from just observing visitors' reactions to heritage sites, including your own.
Great. Thank you for your answer. And yeah, I totally agree with you that if we are making heritage interpretation and presentation, I think it is really important to put our best on how can I say, making our visitors can have their own experience at World Heritage Sites and make their own story and own memory so that they can truly realize and feel the significance and the value of World Heritage Sites. Also, the other heritage sites too. And I'd like to give a question on our word, on the language you've spoken on in your lecture. Well, I've heard that in some countries there are not enough languages that can express the meaning of OUV, our outstanding universal value, and they are also experiencing some problems delivering the significance of World Heritage Sites. So it is causing a lot more problems on having educations with on World Heritage and also heritage, and due to those kind of problems, especially on language, they're experiencing lots of problems on managing sites too. So in those kind of cases, they're experiencing with the difference between language, then instead of explaining what OUV means, what else can we do? Heritage experts or professionals do to support delivering the significance of heritage sites?
Well, I don't think it's an issue of language. Of course, the world is made up of many thousands of different languages, and some people have words for things and other people don't. But what people do understand, and again, go back to this metaphor I'm using of great literature. What do people understand? What cuts across? And what cuts across people are stories of love, of hate, of emotions, of empathy, of sorrow. These are great universal emotions which are felt, throughout every society. They go beyond words, So, engage with the universals of the world, not with the particulars, the universals of communication, and I think, and I'm not sure. In fact, I'm doing myself a disservice here in a sense, but heritage professionals are not necessarily the best people to tell a story. They are so embedded in their own technical language that a good storyteller extracts the meaning and can tell it in a very engaging and entertaining way. And I think sometimes within the heritage sector, we have to leave go. We are very protective. This is ours. We've got our OUV. This is our site. But maybe we need, a good storyteller, to tell the story, or a good writer to tell the story. If I, and increasingly now, and particularly younger generations, they don't get their information from reading lots and lots of text. They get information from Instagram or wherever. They get information in different ways, and we need to engage with that. It doesn't mean to say you dilute the content. You don't dilute the message. You just bypass the technical aspects of language in a sense. But I truly believe that you can reduce World Heritage sites to a series of universals. If you think about something that I've worked with a lot. If you think about industrial heritage, which is very technical, incredibly technical, but World Heritage don't talk about the technical aspects, which are already out of date because the technical aspects of 200, 300 years ago. Talk about man's achievement, the achievement of humanity, the dominance of nature, the power, the ingenuity of creating industrial structures, of the need in society for these things. These are universal things which speak to people rather than the detailed technical aspects. So I think very much about it. For me, it's not a language problem. It's never been a language problem. It's about thinking about, the big stories, the big narratives that World Heritage embodies.
Great, thank you for your answer. And yes, experts and professionals must use different words or different expressions when we are delivering the meaning or the stories of heritage to the public who's not the expert in the field, because those can be another barrier for the public participants and public visitors. So thank you for your answer. And I will read our next question. The next question is, how should we apply for the changed interpretation of OUV of World Heritage when a new generation think the old version of interpretation of heritage should be changed? And how to persuade the older generation? Yeah, that was the question, and quite a complicated one.
Yeah, I'm trying to work through it at the moment. If this is talking about how we should change what OUV means, I mean, because OUV, ever since the concept was developed, it has been a subject of debate, and it will keep going on being a subject of debate. And there are some people who say, well, there's no such thing as OUV, but it is what it is, and it's one of the, it's been fairly sort of a part. It's been the standard, if you like, criteria for evaluating World Heritage, and we know that it's subjective. Of course, it's subjective, and there are many issues with it. I don't think my reading that it's not going to change in its meaning, in its UNESCO meaning, its World Heritage meaning, much at all. I just don't see that. I just don't see that happening. How we communicate it is a different question. And how we communicate it, I think, it needs to be communicated in a much, again, to new generations who really, actually new generations, I think, understand the universal aspect much better than we did in the past. I mean, the world has become a very small place now. So, when you think of something like climate change, which is that is a universal issue. It affects everybody, and actually younger people get that. If we think about, other universals, and again, these are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. If we talk about poverty, global poverty, it's a global issue that affects all of us. What happens in China affects what happens in the United States. What happens in the United States affects Europe. There is a universalism. We are connected. So I think younger generations actually understand the universal bit better than we probably did, 30 or 40 years ago. I think the outstanding bit is a difficult one. I mean, that's why should one European cathedral be better than another European cathedral? That's always going to be. I think that comes. There is a subjectivity involved in that. Whatever anybody, I would always argue that. It doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't be special, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Shouldn't be part of the World Heritage system or part of the process. But you can challenge that. But I think it's not about changing the concept of OUV. The technical concept of OUV is what we would understand from the operational guidelines, but it's about how we can make that more accessible, make that concept more accessible and more relevant to people. And that's back to this issue of using the right concepts, the right words, thinking about context. and I think generally highlighting the universality of it. I think that's how I would address that.
Great. Thank you for your answer. And I think this one might be our last question for today. I will read out our next question. The question is, thanks for the interesting talk, Mike. One of your former students here, and I wanted to ask whether interpretation and communication matters for places fearful of losing their World Heritage Site status, like Liverpool.
Okay, I carefully, this person has said one of my former students. That could be one of many thousands. So they've disguised their identity very well. So whoever you are, nice to hear from you. Yes, interpretation and communication does matter for every World Heritage Site, because technically World Heritage status can be lost. I mean, if management and protection isn't taken seriously, then yes, I mean, you know, Liverpool was an example. But one of the reasons why I think there was an issue with Liverpool is that Liverpool did not communicate its outstanding universal value and its significance to its own communities. So there were many people, and still many people in the city of Liverpool, who didn't even know that it was a World Heritage Site. And of those who knew it was a World Heritage Site, they didn't know what that meant. So there was a failure of communication. So interpretation isn't, I mean, the point of the question is a good point. Interpretation isn't just for visitors. It's for locals as well. You have to interpret your site. And there are so many sites in the world. Again, this comes back to the lack of community engagement, something which we should be doing according to the strategic objectives of community engagement in the Fifth Sea. But are we really doing that? You know, are communities really behind their World Heritage Sites? Or is World Heritage just sort of imposed? One day you wake up and, you know, your town is a World Heritage Site and you didn't know that. So there's a communication process which should start, and an interpretation process which start at the very early signs of a nomination. So everybody is informed. And then maybe, you know, occasions like Liverpool may not happen because people understand the process. And understand what the costs and benefits are, at least, of having World Heritage status. And there are costs to it, but there are clearly benefits. And if you explain how that can happen, you know, you may not get this situation.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer. And yes, especially in case of Liverpool and other World Heritage sites, we can see that we can see the significance of World Heritage interpretation and presentation. Because sharing the significance of World Heritage sites is really significant. Because by doing so, local communities and other public too can realize the significance of World Heritage, and they can have a communication through with other groups of other cultures by learning the culture embedded, history embedded on heritage sites. So it is really important to engage local communities and share the significance of, I mean, having storytelling, sharing storytellings. Sharing stories of heritage sites to local communities so that they can know.
Can I? Sorry to interrupt. You've just made an important point, which I actually probably I should have made a little bit clearer. But you know, one of the things which doesn't happen enough is that World Heritage Sites don't talk to other World Heritage Sites. and they can learn a lot from each other, and they can work together. So what I would have liked seeing to Liverpool was, it was, inscribed partly for some the technical aspects of being a port city, but being a port city, being a mercantile city. Now, there are other mercantile cities and port cities on the World Heritage List, Now, surely together, you can tell the story of how important that is together, much better than just being one. So you're not alone in any of this, So World Heritage Sites need to break down these petty nationalisms. If anything is going to be truly universal, it should be linking with sites which are similar and have similar issues and similar problems and similar stories to tell. So I think that's something which perhaps could have worked much better in Liverpool. Liverpool should have been connected, as it was historically, with other great port cities. And that gives people a sense of pride, gives people a sense that they're not alone in the world, that other people are interested in what they do. So you touch upon a really important point.
Great, thank you. And just to share with you, Morgan Roberts left the last question.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay. Nice to hear from you,
Once
Morgan.
again, we genuinely appreciate you for having an insightful lecture on World Heritage interpretation and presentation today. And would you like to leave your last comment to our public participants today?
Yes, please. Yes. I just want to thank you again and for giving me this opportunity, and also thank everybody, whoever you are, because nobody knows who you are. I don't know who is. It might be 3 people watching me at the moment, but either way, I hope this has been useful and at least getting people to think about how important interpretation is, but how much we need to do, I think, to make interpretation really work, not just for the good of the site, but for the benefit of humanity.
Great. Thank you. I'm sure your lecture has been really insightful and inspiring on the same time, too. Well, then, before we finish today's event, I would like to briefly introduce our next lecture. Our next lecture, Community Engagement in Interpreting World Heritage Values, with Dr. Sarah Court, will be held on 16 November. Further information on the lecture, including the exact time, will be informed on our Facebook page and Instagram. Please check the Facebook and Instagram of the Preparatory Office for further information on the online lecture series. Well, thanks again for joining us today, dear our public participants, and the best regards to all our Preparatory Office members supporting the online lecture series behind the camera. Well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you all on our next lecture. Thank you. Cheers.